Okay, thank you very much for joining our fourth day for the Cloud Security Essential course. In the last week, we covered two modules. Module number one, for the architecture concepts and design requirements, we discussed very important security concepts as general, and we discussed as well some security concept related to the cloud. Also, we discussed the concepts of the cloud computing as the implementation models and the type of implementation. And we mentioned that the implementation models, we have the IaaS, ES, PaaS, SaaS, and the implementation type, we have four different implementation types related to the private cloud, public cloud, community cloud, and hybrid cloud. Then in module number two, we covered the cloud data security. We start in module number two to split the cloud security into areas. In module number two, we covered the cloud data security, and we highlight some important concepts relating to the cloud data security as the encryption. And we mentioned that encryption, this is one of the very important issues which we have to consider it for the isolation of the data and application between multiple tenants. Also, we discussed other concepts as, for example, access control as authentication, authorization, and accounting. And we mentioned that this will be very important. And if you have sensitive data and application, then you have to consider the 2FA concept for authentication. We highlight also other concepts for the securing the data and the retention period, the deleting and sanitization of the data, and we highlight that the data, it should be deleted from the cloud service provider if you decide that you will leave the cloud service provider or you have to migrate to another one. And we mentioned that we have three different types of deleting the data. Some of them are possible in the cloud infrastructures and some others are not. The methods which it can be appropriate for the cloud is the data override, where you can type or override the cloud data. And the other model is the data encryption, and after you encrypt the data, you have to throw out or you have spoiled the key. The other method which is not valid for the cloud computing or cloud hosting is the destroy the hard disks or decoding the hard disks. These are the two modules which we covered last week. Today, we will go to another area for protecting the cloud application services. It's the infrastructure. The infrastructure, it's a very important issue, my friends. And there are some standards. Consider that the application, it will not be secure unless the infrastructure which it hosts these applications are secure. Then this is very important that you have to consider the application infrastructure. You have to make sure that this infrastructure, it provides the appropriate security controls for the application. Although we will discover in the next module that the application, it has its own methodology for protecting the application itself, but again, we have to take in our consideration some of the other factors where we have to protect the infrastructure as well to make sure that your application is secure and it's providing the your application is secure and it's providing the proper protection for your application. Okay. Last week, we discussed the infrastructure for the cloud service provider, especially in the virtualization. And we mentioned that we have two types. We have two types of virtualization, and these two types, which are called type 1 and type 2. And if you can remember, just I will try to refresh your information. We mentioned that in type 1 that you have the host like that. Then we have to install the virtualization software over the host direct, and we install after that the operating system. This type number 1. In type number 2, you have the host. Then we have to install the operating system. Then you have to install the virtualization software. And of course, we said that model or type 1, it's more secure than model 2, because in model 2, the virtualization software, it's affected by the operating system where it's installed on. Then if there is any bugs or problems in the operating system itself, then mean that it will affect the virtualization software. But in type 2, the virtualization software, it will be installed directly on the hardware. Then this means that it will not be affected by the operating systems or patches or whatever related to the operating systems. In the second option, it's the storage. This, again, one of the main components or the or infrastructure, because of course the storage, it will be used for storing the data, application, services, and so on. And usually in the storage, you will have two different types, the object type and the volume type. What is the difference between both of them? The volume type, this is the one which you are familiar with, which all of us know about it. This the hard disk, which it is shared, and each server, it will see this hard disk as an internal hard disk, for this server. It may be a different storage area, or I mean a storage appliance which is connected to the infrastructure. But by the end of the day, the server, it will be able to see it as a hard disk installed on the server itself. You have to take the storage, you have to split it, you have to make multiple parts of the storage, assign each part or each space to a specific server, and so on. Then each server, it will see this storage as built-in hard disk installed on the server itself. The second option, which is relatively new concept, it's the object storage. And the object storage, it will be used for storing the unstructured data as videos, audios, files, and so on. And this data, we are not interrelated to each other. We are discrete files. And the object storage, it will be used for storing this data. It will be very fast, and it will not use FAT or pointers as in the volume storage, but it's using ID, specific ID. Then if you want to access a file, you have to access this file by using its ID. Then it's somehow faster and usually it will be used for, as we mentioned, unstructured data. Then the third components, it will be the computing, and I think all of us familiar with the concept of the memory and the processing, processors and RAM. Finally, the network. Of course, the network component, it's very important. And the network components, we can split it into two parts. Part number one, the internal network. The internal network. This is the internal network which is connected all the devices in the cloud service provider together to each other. We are connected with storage, we are connecting the servers, we are connecting whatever, any hardware devices, any services, whatever it is. When all these devices are connecting together on a single network where it can communicate together and provide the services for the users. On the other hand, you can consider we have another network which is the external network, and this it would be the external network where the users are connecting to the cloud service provider. The cloud service provider, they are reside here. We have their own network, we have services, we have applications, we have the data, and so on. And we have here the internet, where the users are coming from the internet, and we will be able to access these data. When this means that you have the cloud service provider, he has another type of the connectivity. Because this, it can be, for example, it can be a leased line, and this leased line is connected to the internet service provider. It can be a wireless connection to the internet service provider. It can be what we can say, for example, ADSL, whatever the type of the connections where it will be able to allow the user to communicate to the cloud service provider infrastructure. Finally, physical hardware and the environment. When we say physical hardware and environment, usually here, my friends, we mean that the data center. We mean that here we data center and its facilities. The data center here, of course, you know that you must have the data center itself, the environment. When we say environment, this means that it will cover the AC, it will cover the power, it will cover the humidity control, and so on. When these are the environment. And when we say the physical hardware, then this, it will consider the cabinets, the cabling, the full ceiling, the raised floors, and so on. Finally, we will come to the most important component, which is the management plan. The management plan, it is considered the most important component. Why? As we mentioned last week, when we say management plan, this means that this is the interface which is provided by the cloud service provider to the users or administrators. Then they will be able to manage their services. They can provision a server, they can expand the resources, they can add additional application or services or licenses or whatever. Then by the end of the day, the management plan, as it's clear from its name, it is managing the cloud service provider. Then just imagine if the cloud service provider management plan, it was hacked, or the hacker, he has a control over the management plan, then he will be able to control all the network infrastructure, services, applications, hardware, software of the cloud service provider himself. And also they may have access to the data. And also we mentioned whatever any service you will provide it to the user as a cloud service provider, this it will come through API. This it will come through API, application program interfaces. When these application program interfaces, if they are not protected and we are not secure, then this means that we will represent a risk of data breach. And we will cover the API security in the next module for the application security. These are the main components for the cloud infrastructure components. Any questions?
It's pretty much clear.
Sorry, I cannot hear your voice.
It's clear, sir.
Okay, excellent. In the previous slide, we had an overlook on the infrastructure components. Now we will start to have detailed information about part by part, or let's say component by component. The physical environment, as we mentioned, physical environment, it means the data centers and its facilities. We have to keep in our mind that we must provide external redundancy and internal redundancy. Of course, it will be very important for you as a cloud service customer if you want to evaluate the cloud service provider. One of the main challenges which we may face, that you will find a lot of cloud service providers, they are approaching your company and they will tell you that we have services, we have so and so, we can provide you so and so, and we will give you a lot of promises. And you will not discover if they are liars or they are saying the truth until you will have subscription and you will host your data, and unfortunately you may have to migrate your data, and this is really complicated exercise, and finally you will discover that this cloud service provider, they are not qualified and they are not able to fulfill their agreement with you. Then it's better to be able to evaluate the cloud service provider before migrating your data or to make any subscription with them. How you can evaluate? Number one, for the physical environment, you have to make sure that we have redundancy for their infrastructure. Then if we worked on the external redundancy, we have to provide the power lines, redundancy power lines. Because this, it's not logic that a cloud service provider, it will be, or it will depend only on a single power supply. Although in some countries, there may be only single entity to provide the whole power for the country itself. In this case, you have to work very close with the cloud service provider to ensure that this company, or the company which is responsible for providing the electricity in this country, we have two different sources for power for this cloud service provider. Then this power, it may be provided from a specific location, and another source which it will be provided from a different location, as for example. Or in other words, if you are not able to check these different resources, because you may have a cloud service provider which he does not have the two different sources of the power because the government does not provide this. Then what is the alternative? The alternative that they may have generator, power generator. Then if you faced any problem with the power lines, then the generator, it will take over, and this, it can be a replacement or a good replacement for the power. Also, as we covered, the power substations, generators, generator fuel tanks. This, from our practical experience, gentlemen, the main issue in failures, fuel tanks. I know one of the big organization in Saudi Arabia. They had uh, frankly speaking, I don't want to say what is the field of their operation, but they have a very important operation in the market. And because of that, they had a generator and it's installed up and running. Then if they faced any problem with the power, then automatically the generator, it will take over. One day the power is off, and after a few hours, we found that the whole data center is down. And when we made the investigation, we found that the generator does not have fuel. This means that the person who is responsible to provide the fuel for the generator, he is not doing his exercise properly, or there is some problem, whatever the reasons, but by the end of the day, the data center is down, although we have the generator. Okay, also you have to make sure that we have enough network circuits. And when we say network circuits, we mean the external network circuits. The external network circuits, if they have ADSL connection or satellite connection to the internet or leased lines, then they must have multiple connection to the internet. Then if one of the connection is down, users will not feel, because they will fail over to the other connections. Access points, building access points. These access points, how to reach to the building. This it will be again very important, how you can reach to the building, the access points. Cooling and infrastructure, AC. For this, it's very important for the AC and humidity. Because if the AC and humidity are not controlled properly, then this means that the network, it can reach to the high temperature, and this it will affect the devices. Some of the devices, as a protection, it will be disabled or it will powered off, and so on. On the other hand,
Excuse me.
yeah, sure, go ahead.
I need. Can you please again explain what is building access points? I couldn't get it actually.
Okay. When we say the access points here, you have two different concepts. This is what we call it, the physical access points and the logical access point. Physical access point, this means that you have multiple entries or exits or whatever. Then these points, this building, it can be reached by two different gates or whatever. This is what we call it.
Okay, I got it. I mean, it's like physical exit and entry points, right?
Yes, this is the concept number one. The concept number two, it will be as logically, where this means that you will be able to access the infrastructure itself. To access the infrastructure of the network itself. Anyway, I think in the external redundancy here, he means the access point as a physical one. On the other hand, as we covered the external redundancy for the data center from the external environment, we have to provide internal redundancy as well, as power distribution units. This it could be the power units which are installed inside the data cabinets, power feeds for the racks to provide the power, cooling, networking. Here, of course, when we say networking, this it will be the internal network. Here, it was the external network, but here it will be the internal network. This means that if you have one access switch for each cabinet, this it may represent a problem. Because if the access switch is down, then the whole cabinet, it will be down. Then it will be better to have two access switches, even if one of them is sitting idle, doing nothing, and even if it's not connected, but if the production access switch is down, then the administrator, he can replace the switch, and this it will take few minutes. Storage units, you have to provide redundancy storage units, and of course there is no need to explain why. And finally, the physical access points as well for the cabinets and the connectivity. This it's related for the physical environment. Now for the computing. for the computing. There are some concepts, my friends, which I want you to be familiar with. And these are very important when you are working with cloud service providers. What are these concepts? Number one, reservations, limits, and shares. What is reservation? Reservation, this is the minimum amount of resources which it can be guaranteed to the cloud service customer. A cloud service provider, he will tell you, okay, my customer, I can provide you 10 servers, each server with 10 processor maximum and 1 terabyte RAM maximum and 10 terabyte storage maximum. Okay, but what will happen if we have any, I don't want to say any problem, but we have load over the network and the cloud service provider is not able to provide all these values for you if you have any burst in your processing. Then he will say that I will guarantee you minimum amount. Minimum amount. You will never be less than these amounts. I will provide you 5 servers, 5 processors each, half tera RAM each, and total 50 terabyte, for example. This, which we call it reservations. And reservation, this is the minimum amount. This is the minimum amount of the resources guaranteed by the cloud service provider for the cloud customer. When we will come to the limits, it will be on the opposite side. It will be the maximum resources provided by the cloud service provider. It will be the maximum sources provided to the cloud service provider. Why? Why do you need to have, in some situation, limits or maximum resources? According to what we explained last week, the beauty of the cloud service provider that if I have an application and it's require a server, for example, 5 processors and let's say 32 GB RAM and 10 terabyte, it will work great. And if I have any marketing campaign or I want to make sale and I'm expecting that there will be a lot of purchasing, it will come to my website. When this being that one server, it may not be enough. And what I have to configure, I have to configure that the resources, it should be upgraded dynamically. Then if the one server, it will not be enough, then automatically another server, it can be created and it will use a load balancer, then it can load the balance between the 2 servers. Or instead of having 2 server, I can still use 1 server, but increase the number of processors from 5 to 10 and the memory from, let's say, from 32 GB into 64 GB. Again, this, it will be okay with me, and this, it will can handle this application. But in some situation, if you will have a limit or the cloud service provider, he will have limit or you configure a limit for the account of the customer, then this means that when he will reach the limit, he will never be able to make any dynamic increase in the resources utilized by the applications. This, it will be a problem. You will not be able, for example, the website is hosting 1,000 users. Within a specific time, it may be light in a country or whatever, then instead of 1,000, it increased into 2,000 or 3,000. Then the number of the processors, memory, or in other words, resources, it should be increased dynamically to support the server. But according to the limits, which are defined by the cloud service provider, no additional resources, it will be assigned by the server to the servers. Then what will be the situation? There will be performance degradation. Question for you. Why do we need limits if it will affect our performance or it will cause service degradation? Why do you need the limits? Any answer?
No, sir. Actually, I couldn't able to understand the entire concepts of limits.
The maximum resources which you can reserve from the cloud service provider. So simply like that.
I think we are paying for what we are requesting only. So if we assign a specific number of cores and specific number of storage and a specific number of memory, so we are paying for what we are getting. And if we need increase, we can pay more for it.
Okay, that's right. But suppose that your application required. As we mentioned, you have an exercise where you have a marketing campaign or a sale and number of users increased from 1,000 to 3,000. Then by the end of the day, this is the business.
So يعني, at that time, if there is a need, we will pay for the only needs that we needed. So that's why we are making limitation. We cannot get something which is more than we need, and we cannot get something which is less than we need. If there is already something that shows to us that our usage is how many % of our assigned, it means that we are going on the correct limit, or we are exceeding the limits that we have gotten.
No, let me explain the scenario once more. The limits means that these are the maximum resources which you can acquire from the cloud service provider. Now your application runs on one server. The application, as normal traffic, it will require 5 GB RAM, 32 GB RAM, 10 terabyte, 5 processors. Due to marketing campaign, the number of users increases from 1,000 users, which are hosted by the server in the normal situation, into 3,000 users. And this means that the existing resources, it will not be enough. Then, as one of the characteristics of the cloud, that the resources can increase dynamically without interaction with the cloud service provider. When it finds that there is a burst in the processing, then it can acquire more processors, it can acquire more storage, it can acquire more memory. Then in your situation, after the 3,000 users, the server requires, instead of 32 GB RAM, which is configured right now, it requires 128 GB RAM. And it requires, instead of 10 terabyte hard disk, require 50 terabyte. And instead of 5 processors, it requires 10 processors. But when these resources started to be assigned to your server, it's stuck. Why? Because the cloud service provider, he mentioned, please don't provide this customer more than 7 processors, and don't provide him more than 64 GB RAM, and don't provide him more than 20 terabyte. Then this means that dynamically the resources which you require, this is business. You need it for business. You will pay for it only because you use it as a business. But after you finish the processing or the marketing campaign and the number of users increases again from 3,000 into 1,000, then this means that all the acquired resources, it will be released and it will maybe used by another customer, or it will go back to the resource pool. You got the scenario now? Is it clear?
Yes, it is clear.
Right. Why we need the limits? Okay, we will need the limits for different reasons, not single reasons, for different reasons. Reason number one, suppose that I am a hacker. How can I penetrate or how can I compromise a cloud service provider network very easily without doing any reconnaissance or penetrate his network? What I have to do just to have what we can say a normal subscription. I want a VM. Okay, they will provide me a normal VM. And I am now a legitimate user. I acquired a server, two processors, 16 GB RAM, and 1 terabyte. As I am a hacker, what I will do, I will create any script or program or whatever. It will do some processing, and this processing, it will be exponential increased. Then every time it will create a new process, which it will consume memory and processor, consume memory and processor, consume memory and processor, and so on. And each processor which it will consume memory and processor, it will never end. You remember, I don't know if you are aware about this or not. This it was a long time ago. There was a virus called the NIMDA virus. And this NIMDA virus, when it was infected any machine, this machine, it will not be responding. When people are saying that machines are hanging. Actually, machines are not hanging. But we are not responding to the users. When if he is trying to run any application or do anything, he will not be able to do. Why? Although it's not hanging, because the NIMDA virus, it will create 4 processes, and each process, it will consume 25% of the processor time. Then by the end of the day, the NIMDA virus creates 4 processes, and all of them consume 100% of the processor. Then the processor, it is not able to receive any connection or any comments from the legitimate users. Again, if we have a tool which it will be able to create these processes, and this process, it will consume memory and the processor, then just imagine the services which are in, the resources, I mean, which I acquire from the cloud service provider, it will be utilized. It will be used. Then there is another process. It requires memory and processor. Then it will increase dynamically. It will get one more processor and say 1 GB more, then another one, then another one, then another one, and so on. This, it will be unlimited. And just imagine, if I don't have the limits, then instead of having 2 processors which are really acquired, then I can reach to up to 10 or 20 or 25 or 30. And as soon as I acquire these resources, this means that it will affect the other users because or other customers, because by the end of the day, you are utilizing shared resource pool. When if you are occupying or acquire 50% or 70% or 80% of these resources, when the other user will not find any resources and they will not be able to perform their processes and services. Then point number 1, to protect against any hacker or maybe a bug in any application which it will require resources and it will increase to very high limits, maybe whatever, it's bad intention or a good intention. The other point, there is another type of attacks which is considered in organizations related to cloud service providers. Cloud service providers, they are allowing you to create any server with the required configuration and operating systems. This is a nice feature, but on the other hand, it may be a bad feature for the administrators. Why? Because, you know, I'm a developer, I want to create a service or I want to test an application, then I will create a server. Then I will create another server. After some times, I will not disable these services. I will create another server. Then I create a third server, and so on. Then by increasing the number of servers which I am creating, this it will be cost. I will find that when I receive the monthly invoice, that these values, it may be reached to thousands, although I'm not using them. There may be some application which is installed on this server and it's utilize these servers or whatever, but actually I can disable this service. Then here we will use the limits that you are not allowed to configure more than 20 servers for the, what we can say, the customer. Then if I reached to this limit, I have to call the customer. Hey, my customer, you reached to the limit. Do you want me to extend this number to 25 or 30 servers? If the business needs required, then you have to agree and we have to increase the limits. Otherwise, you have to say no, and you have to check the actual servers which you use, and you have to disable the others. These are the reasons why we have the limits. Finally, we will have the shares. What are the shares? With the shares, it's considered some sort of priority. Some sort of priority. Suppose that you have customer 1 and 2. The customer 1, you give him share 70%, for example, and 2, you gave him 50%. You may have other customer number 3, and you give him 20%. Now, for some reasons, your network, it's really occupied. All the resources are occupied. Yani, let's say, to make life easy, that you have 3, only 3, you have 10 processors, and you have, for example, 1 terabyte RAM. These are the 3 resources in the resource pool. And now the 3 customers, 1, 2, 3, they require resources out of the resource pool. But unfortunately, user 1 require plus user 2 and user 3 require more than the 10 processors. More than the 10 processor. Let's say, for example, the user 1 required 6 processor, user this required 2, this required 5. Then the total is 15, but I don't have 15, I have only 10. Then how these processors it will be distributed? How these processors should be distributed? This it will be a problem. Is it distributed based on the number of processors they require? If this one, customer 1 requires 6, then I have to provide him, for example, 3, and this requires 4, I provide him 2, and so on? No. In cloud service providers, they are not considering this concept. What they are considering? We consider the share. They will check what is the share value when this user, he has highest priority, then customer 2, then customer 3. When this user, we have to provide him with his full needs. Or the resources, it should be distributed based on this percentage. It should be distributed based on this percentage. And this, it will be the share, it will be used in a case if the required resources from all the customers are not available in the resource pool, and we have to share the remainder of the resource pool between all of them. And this is the reason why we call it share, because we want to share the remainder of the resource pools. These are the three important concepts which you have to understand in the cloud service provider. This is very important. You have to work very close with your cloud service provider to define these values based on the customer or your needs as a customer. Any questions?
It's all depend about how the resource get shared. This is all about, right?
Yes, of course. Because by the end of the day, this is a cloud service provider to share resources between customers, to provide the minimum resources to be provided, maximum resources to be provided, and how to share the resources if all the resources are not enough to be shared with all the customers. These are simply the definitions of these terminologies. Okay, the second component for the infrastructures is virtualization. And I think we covered the type 1 and type 2, and we explained the difference between both of them. And of course, we mentioned that type 1, this is the more secure. And do you know examples of type 1 hypervisors? Any example? Do you know any example of type 1 hypervisor? You did not face or work with virtualization at all? Of course, the most popular type 1 hypervisors, Hyper-V from Microsoft, VMware, and you have the
Oracle
AVM or something like that. I cannot remember the exact name right now. But again, this, yes, someone, Rahab, she mentioned. Okay, please, can you share the information with us, Rahab? What you are saying, it's interesting.
I'm till now I'm using the KVM, and this is for Linux based. Oracle sharing is Oracle hypervisor is based on KVM. Same like Nutanix hypervisor is also based on KVM, and it's using it as AHV. So they are using the Linux hypervisor, and they are changing it by its name. Each one is giving his name, because this is Linux and open source, anyone can use it. So this is KVM, and the other one is I have used it is Hyper-V. We are not using in the production. We are using it for testing only. We didn't use it in the production for anything. VMware, we are using it some servers also, but all of that we didn't work on it on cloud. We worked on it on the hypervisor only for our servers in the on-premise.
Okay, great. Thank you for this information. As Rehab shared her experience with us, I think the most popular type 1 hypervisors are KVM. And as she mentioned, because this is open source and it's free, you can utilize it. Usually, I I saw the KVM in the non-profit organizations, in universities, in some organizations as well. And frankly speaking, it's doing great. Although it it's open source, but it requires more administration and background of Linux and Unix. VMware, it's one of the paid application and it's really stable. It's a good one and it's considered for hypervisors. Hyper-V, it's for Microsoft, and I don't know, but yani, I am feeling that Hyper-V, it will be great for small and medium, although Microsoft, we are saying for enterprise, but when I worked with enterprise customers as banks, as hospitals, as whatever, just name it, we will prefer VMware. Okay, the type 2 hypervisor, this, it will be very simple, the examples which we have it on our notebooks. Sometimes you will say, okay, I want to install Linux on my machine. I am a Windows user and I want to install Linux, then I will get any application from VMware or Oracle or whatever. There are a lot of free personal virtualization software which you can install it as a service or application on your machine, and you can create a server, then you can install the operating system and application, and it can run on your PC. Okay. The second component, which is one of the very important component, and we discussed this in the beginning of our session, but we will discuss it again because it's very important, the management plan. And we mentioned that the management plan, this is the interface where you have access for administrating your service. And the management plan, this, it will help you to provision servers, to upgrade servers, to add more resources, to remove resources, to monitor your network, to read your logs, to have some events. When it's by the end of the day, it's administrating of that. And as we mentioned, this, it will be a very important component, because if there is any hacker, he was able to access the management plan, then he will have full control over the cloud service provider infrastructure, and this means that he will have full control over your applications, data, and so on. The management plan, it's in the form of application program interfaces, because by the end of the day, you have multiple and resources like storage, like what we can say servers, maybe hardware devices and load balancers or whatever. You have a lot of components, and if you note that all these components, it has its own management plan. Yani the storage, it has its own management plan, server, it has own management plan, and so on. When this means that the cloud service provider, we have to create the management plan, a common management plan, which it can integrate all these management plan together, then you can work with them. You can, for example, assign some servers with processors, storage, memory. You can have, for example, a disaster recovery side by saying that I want to have on a different data center the same infrastructure as I have in this data center. When if there is any problem with the production data center, then it will take over to the disaster recovery side and it will work. Then these are the components which you have to consider when you are working with the infrastructure security. Let's say these are the basic components, because of course there are a lot of other components which you can consider it with other concepts, and this detailed information, it can be covered in the CCSB course, of course. Okay. If you don't mind, just we will have a break for 10 minutes. Okay. Now we will continue for the infrastructure security for cloud service computing. And we have to take in some consideration the design and plan security controls. Of course, it's very important to understand the security controls of the cloud service provider, or it may be yourself because you have a private cloud implementation, and this means that you are responsible for providing the security controls to protect your data and application. For physical and environment protection, this it will be important because this it would be considered as the first step or first layer in protecting your infrastructure and data center. You have to provide the appropriate data center protections, as example, fences, lights, CCTV, guards. You have to provide powerful access controls. You have to provide logs for the entrance of the data center. You have to provide cages, and these cages must be isolated. You have to provide the appropriate environment protection for power, for AC, for humidity, and so on. The second issue for the protection is the system and communication protection. System and communication protection, it will be again important because these are the devices which you have to protect, and also the communication as well. When whatever any systems hosted in the data center as servers, as storage, hardware, software, and so on, it must be protected and have the appropriate controls. Besides the communication, and mainly the communication for the internal network, where in some situation you may have to encrypt the whole traffic inside the internal network, and also the traffic for the external network using the should be encrypted using the DLS and SSL. Virtualization systems protection. As we clarified, virtualization, it is considered as a backbone for the cloud service providers. We have the type 1 hypervisors. Protection of the virtualization depends upon the manufacturer recommendations. Also, as we mentioned that in virtualization environment, you can have firewalls, you can have IPS, you can have whatever any controls or technical controls. And these controls, it's not as a concept which we are familiar with. When we say firewall, if you are familiar with firewall, for example, Cisco ASA, you know that it's an appliance. You have to buy an appliance, and this appliance, we have the software installed on it, and it has some interfaces where you have to connect it to your network zones. But when you have this firewall installed in cloud service provider or virtualization environment, it will not be appliance, of course, but by the end of the day, it will be an image. It's just an image. And you have to acquire a server or a VM from the cloud service provider and install this image over the VM. Then this means that you have an equivalent firewall or ASA firewall from Cisco. It is exactly the same because the same image and everything. Identification, authentication, authorization, or in other words, we call it IAM. IAM, this identification, authentication, IAM, identity access management. Identity access management, it's very important. It consists of 4 components. Identification, who are you? Authentication, you have to identify yourself. And authorization, what you are allowed to access, service or hardware or applications. And finally, accountability, what are the actions or activities which you perform on the network. Last week, we discussed the federation, and we mentioned that the federation, it's a service which allow you to host your user credentials for specific organization in one location. It may be in your location as an organization, for example, it will be okay, or maybe at the cloud service provider, or maybe at a sophisticated cloud service provider who is providing the service of hosting user credentials, whatever. But by the end of the day, if you have multiple cloud services with the different cloud service providers, then you don't need to have user credentials with each one of them. What you have to do to enable the federation between your Active Directory or whatever the infrastructure which or platform which you use it for the authentication, it will host all the information for your users. And if there is any service hosted in a cloud service provider want to authenticate, they know that when they will receive your username, it will be at yourcompanyname.com or .net or whatever. When we know that the authentication service for this user, it should be on his side, because there is a federation configuration between their authentication server and your authentication server. Then they will take the credential which you provided during your login, and the cloud service provider authentication server, it will send it to your organization authentication server. If it's right, then it will accept it and it will send the information for the services which you will be able to access. Access control, it's a very, very, very important issue. As a security specialists, you have to understand the access control very well. Don't forget two important things for the access control. When you are accessing the management plan for the cloud service provider, and if you are accessing the administrative or privileged accounts, you must use 2FA. You must use 2FA. This will be very important. As we mentioned, that these two types of accounts can provide administrative and privileged access for the user. Then if these accounts are hacked by hackers, then this means that he will be able to get full control on the network and on the data of the customers as well. Okay. Audit mechanisms. The audit mechanisms, this is okay. Questions?
Yeah, Osama, I'm so sorry to interrupt you.
No
I
problem.
have got a question on the identification, authentication, and authorization. So when you said that we need to take care of two-factor authentication, so I just wanted to ask you, I was going through Microsoft Azure, and they said that they are doing the multi-factor authentication. So how it does relate with two-factor authentication with multi-factor authentication?
By the way, usually when we say multi-factor authentication, this is equivalent to 2FA. Usually,
Oh,
some
okay. So
people they
there's no
call it
difference.
No, there is no difference, because
Okay.
what is the two-factor authentication? You know that number one, it is something you have, or let's start from scratch, something you know. Number two, something you have. And number three is something you are, right? These are the three factors. These are the three factors which are used for authentication. Something you know, it can be username and passwords. something you have. It can be the token, it can be mobile, or it can be email, where I can send a key or passphrase for you. Something you are, it is the biometrics. But if you are using the authentication by any one of them, this considered single factor. This considered single factor. If you start to have more than one factor together, as usually when you will open a bank account and you want to authenticate, it will ask you for the user account. Then it will ask you for your password. After you enter this information, then it will give you, it will not open the account, no. It will give you another screen and it will tell you what is the code which you receive it on the email or the SMS, whatever, how you are configured. Then when you define this code, then automatically you will have the access. In this case, how many factors do you use? This number one and this number two. Something you know, the password, and something you have the the email or SMS. Then usually we are using 2FA, two-factor authentication. But in some situations we are saying MFA. In some situations we call it MFA, multiple factor authentication. But frankly speaking, I did not see anyone use more than two-factor authentication. It may be, as we mentioned, password and key, or it may be in some situation, for example, when you are accessing a data center and you have control, then you have these numbers, you have to enter a specific number, this which we call it something you know, and you have to use eye fingerprint or eye print or fingerprint. Then this number two, then this it will consider again 2FA and so on. Then when we are saying two multiple factor authentication, actually you will find that we are the 2FA. Okay.
Okay, so when so even though if we say MFA, multi-factor authentication, this will cover all three parameters, as you know, you have and you are, right?
It should be.
Okay.
If we are saying multiple factor authentication, yes, it can be used with three factors together. But as I told you, I did not see any device using or any entity using the three types. Of course, I'm not saying that this is not there, because I don't know everything in security field. There may be some, maybe military organizations or whatever we use it, it may be. But commercially, I did not see this exercise.
Okay, got it.
Okay. The last security control, the audit mechanisms, and I consider the audit mechanism, this is the backbone of the auditing, accounting, checking your network. Just imagine, my friends, if you have any activities and you don't have a proper log collection, then you will not be able to do anything for your security control and to understand your infrastructure. Usually, you will have what we call it the log collection. The log collection, this it will be a service where the devices, the hardware, the software, the applications, the whatever any software or hardware base, it will send all the logs These logs, it can be the login, failure login, success login, who's accessing what, if you are doing any administration tasks, whatever, then these logs. These logs, it can be sent in form of SNMP protocol, or it can be sent in form of syslog. Again, it depends upon the device which it send the data and the device which collect the data. It is very important to understand that in the security field that the logs cannot work on its own. The logs, in some situation, you may find some devices as firewalls, daily log file, text log file 10 MB. Just imagine the firewall, it can logs 10 GB text data. Can you think that you will be able to read anything out of this text information? Then the logs as itself, it's useless. It will not be important. It will be considered as a data. But when you will import this data into any application as any syslog server or SNMP server and so on, when you will be able to search in this data, you can print basic reports and so on, then you will be able to utilize the information and the activities on your network. In the security field, we are not using only the log collection and the basic reporting tools. We are using something called SIM. The SIM, these are servers, and they have the ability to collect the logs. It can be in the form of SNMP, it can be in the form of syslog, it can be in the form of text, whatever the type of the logs, it can collect it, and it will take all these logs and what we can say aggregate it in one database. When this means that you may have logs from application, from Windows, from operating system, from a service, from hardware, from a switch, from whatever it is, from a network, whatever the device. Then it will have something called correlation rules. It will start to use AI or machine learning and to understand this correlation based on some rules you define. Then it will be able to discover some abnormal activities or maybe attacks. Then in some devices, it will not be able to discover an attack. But if you go through the logs through multiple devices, then you will discover that there is an attack or this type of attacks and so on. Then in this situation, these SIM servers, when you will configure the rules, it will be able to make the correlation and to discover some sort of attacks and give you the wordings, and this wording, it can be sent over SMS or email or whatever the type of the notification method depends upon the tool itself. We have also the packet capturing. This again, one of the main important issues, and I am quite sure if you are working in the security field or the network field, you work with the packet capturing. You know the old tool which is called Shark. The Shark, it was a tool. It's used for collecting or capturing the packets. I think the name of it right now.
You're talking about Wireshark?
Sorry?
Is it Wireshark?
Is it what?
Wireshark?
Wireshark.
The software.
Yeah. These are the tools which is able to collect the data, and these are very important. These Wireshark, they are able to catch the data. Then in the analysis pane, you will find the bucket of the data related to layer 2, and bucket of the data relating to layer 3, and bucket of the data relating to the layer 7, which is the data itself. This is some way it can be used for capturing capturing this data. Although packet capturing, it's used for ethical reasons for analyzing your network, but on the other hand, it can be used for unethical or by hackers. If they're able to capture the packets, then they will be able to read the data. Then in this situation, you have to consider the encryption. And as we mentioned, the encryption, it will be a very important topic which you have to consider in the cloud services, because this it will provide you with the protection against hacking. Okay. Any questions? Okay. We spoke about the security of the cloud service provider. Now we will speak about the disaster recovery and business continuity management. And again, we discussed the business continuity management and disaster recovery, I think last week, and we mentioned that the business continuity, it's concentrating on the continuity of the business by using whatever any methods. It can be HA as high availability, it can be by using different sites or active standby or whatever the concept, or even if they are saying the whole data center is down, it will say thank you very much, I don't want the IT infrastructure during the disaster or during this period, and I will go back to the logs and papers, and I will continue my operation till the data center is up and running. In the disaster recovery, this is relating to failover the service, not in normal situation, but in the case of a disaster, there may be a fire, flood, earthquakes, volcano, whatever. When we say that the production data center, it's not working, it's out of service, then you have to choose another location where you can fill over your services. And of course, the cloud service provider make the disaster recovery and business continuity piece of cake, because very important issue, my friends, if you are working for your organization, you have to think about anyone now he is working in bank sector, financial sector, or hospital. Anyone who is working in the hospital sector or financial sector?
I'm working in a manufacturing sector.
Okay. Even manufacturing as well, because manufacturing usually the factories are working 24/7, and this is very important. The data, it should be available. Just imagine if you want to build a data center, or you want to build a new application, what you have to do? You have to take care about the production, you have to provide the infrastructure for the production, and the redundancy. It can be another server, or it can be another device, or whatever. But on the other side, you have to take in consideration the continuity and disaster recovery if you have any problem, because these are the data, you cannot say that you will be able to continue without any data. Just imagine you are in hospital and your patient, he came and he want to make an appointment and his file is not there. Doctor will say, I'm really sorry, I will not be able to meet this patient because I don't have his medical record, and I will not be able to follow up his situation and his case. Also, in the financial situation, what will happen? If the data for a bank is down for some time. Just imagine if the data is down for some time and you are not able to connect your bank financial record, then this means that you will not be able to do all your business, and on the other side, the bank, it will lose its reputation, it will lose its customers, it will lose the current customer base, and so on. Then now, if you have the on-ground or on-premises data center, you have to take in your consideration the business continuity and disaster recovery in your mind. And this will cost you, again, small portion of money. Why? Because this means that you have to do the infrastructure and standby infrastructure in a different location. It may be cold site, hot site, warm site, depends upon your business. And this, again, it will cost money. But when you will have a data center in the cloud service cloud service providers, there is no need to care about business continuity, because even if the data center is down, when another data center, it may be in a different country or different city, it depends upon the size of the cloud service provider, it will take over. For example, if I'm speaking about AWS, I think we have data centers in 54 countries. And sorry, we have 54 data centers, but the 14 countries, I think. If you are speaking about Google, we have the same number of data centers across the world. When this means that whatever any cloud service provider, enterprise one, business continuity is a piece of cake. And they will provide you the service even if the service or main production data center for your country is down. The service, it will be fell over to other data center and you will work immediately. And in some situation, you may not feel, or you will feel a little bit performance degradation, when after that, the service it will come back again. In the disaster recovery and business continuity, it's very important to understand what are the business requirements, because the business requirements, for example, in a bank, you cannot say that if the production site is down, then the other service, it will take 1 day or 2 days or 3 days to be up and running again. Not be acceptable. And this maximum, it will allow 30 minutes. When the total RTO, which it will be accepted, it will be only 30 minutes when you can fill over the service and the service is up and running within 30 minutes maximum. Then this depends upon the nature of your business and the requirements of the top management. Also, you have to understand the risks. It's very important. For example, if you have hosted application in a cloud service provider, you have to understand the jurisdiction. And you remember when we say the jurisdiction, this is the laws applied in the countries where the data is reside. Yeah, for example, if you have your data reside in France, Germany, England, whatever, any country of European Union members, when this means GDPR, it will be one of the rules, or I mean one of the laws which you have to consider. Or if you have any information of EU citizens, then again GDPR, it will be valid. If you have any information reside in Saudi Arabia, then the NCA regulation should be followed. If you have the data center reside in states, then the HIPAA, SOX, whatever any laws, it should be valid. But you have to take care of all these requirements as a business requirements, laws and regulations, risks, because one of the main risks is the different jurisdiction where the laws and regulations are different. The best approach where you have to think about the disaster recovery and business continuity is the step 4, design or define the scope, understand the requirements of the business and the top management. You have to analyze these requirements and check for the risks, make the design and implement it, then test it and report it to the management. And finally, you have to make a continual improvement as revise it if there is any modifications or additional services to ensure the effectiveness and the efficiency of the service. Now we covered the third module for the infrastructure security of cloud service providers.